So welcome back to our series, Chats with Dr. Ted. This is a series of educating and understanding mental health challenges and techniques and strategies to better cope, better understand, and better going forward. So we have Dr. Ted with us here today again. Thank you, Dr. Ted, for being here. I don't think it's only me. Since December 2019 in some parts of the world, in some places, March 2020, since then, we've been going through a huge shift, a whole 180-degree change in our lives. We've lost so much. We needed to adapt. We needed to cope, to survive. And, COVID and the pandemic has really shifted our lives. Do you think we'll ever get back to the normal we knew before?
Well, I think we always talk about the new normal, and things are starting to open up a bit, in different parts of the world, including Toronto. But also there are news that there may be new surges that may lead to lockdown again. So all this is so uncertain. And this is such a big topic. I think what I could do that could be helpful actually to my patients is actually not really to look at managing the pandemic directly, but on lessons and reflections we can pick up from our dealings with the pandemic. Even with that, there are so many things. For example, a lot of people have lost a lot. There are people who have lost their lives. Or family members or relatives who have lost their lives, and they have lost their job and under their earnings. So all these are very difficult issues. But I would like to just address 2 to 3 reflection on COVID that might be useful, not just during this normal or new normal, but also in going forward when we deal with other challenges in life as well.
Absolutely. I think this is something that we've been hearing on and off about. It's not returning to how it was before, but a new and adapted normal for everyone to feel a sense of normality again. You mentioned, there are 3 topics and focuses and reflections that you hope that our viewers can take away. Can help us understand that.
The first thing is about risk assessment. How does one address this risk? And some people, would be so concerned about the risk of getting COVID, they would totally, even though there's no lockdown, they will lock themselves down. And would change their life so drastically that actually that has led to them developing a lot of mental health issues. On the other hand, there are other people who now feel that really the lockdown has been too long, and then they don't see too much of this. This thing is just like the normal flu, so they just try to go about life totally disregarding any risk, actually to the detriment of themselves and the people around them. Just last week, one of my patients as a mother who got COVID, but she said, really, it's just a normal flu. She would go about meeting her other children, and eventually the whole family of the brother got COVID. So those are 2 ends of addressing risk assessment. So today I'd like to talk about how actually we address risk assessment.
And that's very important, because you mentioned it's sort of the opposite polar ends of the spectrum. One being completely locked in, trapped in, and not, even, I think we're all human beings and we all need that sense of connection sometime. And unfortunately, what the pandemic has done is lock some of us in our homes, and kind of having a huge fear of stepping out of my home is already the biggest risk I can take. And so I think that's one polar end of the side. And on the other hand, completely, not being aware of there is a risk, whether oblivious or ignorant of the actual risk that is out there, can harm people around, can be a danger to people who are exposed to the virus as well. And very interesting to kind of hear, how do we make a proper risk assessment, Dr. Ted?
Yeah. So I'd like to look at risk assessment itself because, risk is in everyday life in almost everything we do. And if we look back even at our Stone Age ancestors, they had a lot of risk too, actually more than we do. When they venture out of the caves and try to hunt for their daily meals, really, they may not even be able to return home because they might be eaten by the saber-toothed tiger they try to hunt. So our mind, actually our brain, has been particularly it's alerted to anything that's negative. Anything negative stimuli we pay more attention to than things that give us a positive stimuli. So this negative bias in our brain actually set us off to be picking up all the negative, stimuli. And for the life of a Stone Age ancestor, I think that is necessary. But in our everyday life now, actually, civilization has got to the degree that a lot of these common dangers are eliminated. There may be some new danger, but then overall, it's still less than the Stone Age ancestors. So our brain has not developed to suit this current situation in that we still have a lot of negative bias. So for people who have such a temperament, particularly to be anxious and worrisome, then that would be highly developed. And for others who might have a very negative experience before trauma, that also might become extra sensitive. So knowing that is important, that we need to look at our negative bias and see whether it is serving us.
And fears are innate to protect our lives, to help us survive, to help us not lose our lives. And so I think you picked up a really key point. Is it sometimes it gets to the point when we focus on our fears, when we focus on the negative biases, it can actually hinder us from being able to do certain things. And having that risk assessment is so key, because what are things that will affect my life, but what are things that I can walk by and pass by and not being very anxious and worried about that sort of risk, and believing that we'll be able to go out or meet up with people with social distancing. So I think that's a very important key to acknowledge.
Yeah. So to do proper risk assessment, you really need objective, trustworthy data. And that is where the problem is, in that there's so much misinformation, and at times, even with the public health, the directions also change, and without adequate explanation. So it's really difficult. But I'm not trying to give you my set of criteria as to how I conduct my life, or I want my patients to conduct my life. I think everybody owes it to themselves to look at the data and make certain decisions. And if those decisions are made, to stick with them until there are major changes, instead of changing it every single day. That's the thing, if you just allow anything to affect you and change it every day, it's going to be very confusing and unproductive. In fact, risk assessment, when we look at risk, we are particularly wary of negative stimuli when it is something that happens close to us. For example, if you know that I know somebody who just died from COVID, then of course that will swing your pendulum towards the side to be particularly scared and anxious. Or you hear it enough times. You see, that is why the echo chamber of this Facebook and other things are so effective is because you just get all these messages, and then that repetition makes you feel they are real.
Mm.
So knowing the mechanism of how these negative bias develop is so important. That's why I'm still harping on the same thing. We need to be wary that our negative bias is so active that we need to tame it a little bit and fall back on more objective data to say, for example, that right now there's so many deaths from COVID in USA, but there's still much less than from motor vehicle accident. So if you dare go across the street or drive, actually, if with proper precaution, of course, you would put the same precaution on you're going out, then you should be safe.
That's a very good point. And I don't think when we see COVID very in the front, kind of in the headlines of news,
Yeah.
we aren't aware of the data comparison, the motor vehicle accidents versus COVID related deaths. I think there are so many sources of worries and anxiety that COVID has brought to the surface, and learning how to do your own proper assessment, proper risk assessment, excuse me, is really important. It's tailored to each individual. And Dr. Ted, you mentioned a very key point, always kind of consider the data that's being shared and being a little bit more particular about the numbers instead of just reading the headlines of what the news and media deliver to you. We can't expect zero risk in anything we do. It's not a life that human beings are brought to live. I hope you would talk more about that later. But we've had this idea or this topic that's been raised, vaccinations, but so many of us are afraid of that as well.
Yeah. Actually, one more point is that I talk about those who are very scared, but also the other group who are not scared at all. You see, that judgment is affected by wishful thinking. The sense that they really want to have fun and go to parties and things like that. And that override their objective judgment. And also the feeling that we need freedom, right?
Yes.
That's a very political term now.
Yeah.
The wanting freedom is so natural for all of us. But then when they cloud our judgment and then hurt us and other people around, like I just mentioned, the mother of my patient. So that would also be a miscalculation of the risk. So I think we should sit back and assess our risk and then make up our rules, but also keep to them. Instead of allowing daily happenings to change it day to day, because that's too demanding on our mind and our emotion.
That would be very exhausting if we had to switch on and off and to change our habits and adapt every single day in a new day. I guess in a way, values such as freedom can affect our judgment. I hope understanding our fears, I hope understanding our risk with an objective lens in consideration can help us to make a more rational decision.
And that applies to vaccination, right? So all the freedom fighters would say no vaccination, right? And then all the others just getting the vaccination and still scared, get enough protection. Yeah. And both would be erroneous in my opinion.
Yeah. So anything in between would be.
Well, I mean, there are medical reasons for people not to have the vaccination. They are not a lot. And people just think of other things. Oh, I have this and this condition. Maybe I should not get it. So in a way, without checking with the doctor or believing the doctor, they feel that the vaccine may be dangerous to my health. So they avoid it. Understanding this, of course, is that vaccination is something we do to ourselves. So that makes you even more cautious. I should not do things to myself that are in risk, put myself at risk. without seeing the other side. If I don't do something to myself, I may put myself at risk, right? But the fact you do it makes it harder to decide.
Yeah.
Right? So these are things. So I am again not telling people to vaccinate, not vaccinate. I don't want to take those positions. There are lots of those around in the media. But I just want people to understand how we assess this risk so that they wouldn't be fooled by this, kind of negative bias or emotion and other things, so that they truly can protect themselves.
Right. So, that is a way to make every individual's proper for every individual's risk assessment in a way, to acknowledge the negative biases, to almost challenge them at times, and to bring in an objective lens to weigh where am I, where is my risk, and I totally agree, Dr. Ted. We can't, professionals can't tell patients and clients what to do, because that's not how it works, but for them and to educate them with how they can make that risk assessment is so key.
Okay, so the other point I'd like to bring up is about the lockdown. As I said, lockdown may be a thing of the past, but it may be a thing of the future as well. So we need to understand how that impacts us, aside from the fact we don't like them. Now, I think lockdown is interesting to me because I realized then actually how much of our lives are actually decided by things outside of us. For example, we go to work every day before, then that becomes something we don't have to think. Every day we go to work. And something almost like we have to do this for the family every day, so we do it every day. So the lockdown actually has shaken that up. So you don't know actually what is needed now because, for example, you don't have to go to work or you cannot go to work. So what do you do with your time? You have those 24 hours, you don't know what to do with them. And that actually, you can see that as an opportunity to ask yourself, what actually do I like to do with my life? Instead of allowing the circumstances to decide on our life, And as well, you can look at people. We have to go to meet this people. We have to meet that person. Really, do you want to meet them, right?
Yes.
A lot of people actually use this pandemic to say that, gee, I have an excuse now not to meet with them.
Yeah.
You choose who you want to relate to. And in fact, by using the Zoom like we are doing now, we are able actually to connect to anybody across the world.
Yeah.
So some of my patients, I encourage them to look up their old friends in Hong Kong. They haven't talked for 30 years. But when they get together, they feel so good.
Yes.
So in a way, that really gets us to look at how we relate to the environment, how we relate to people.
What that's so interesting. We think of lockdowns as disconnection. We think of lockdowns as isolation. And it definitely feels like that at times because a big chunk of our life has been, taken away or eliminated. And so I think, Dr. Ted, you bring up a very interesting and helpful lens to take a look at this pandemic and lockdowns. We can see it as an opportunity to get to know ourselves, an opportunity to consciously choose who we want to relate to, and also even creating new and lost relationships that have, that life has taken away, going to work, having families has taken away from us. And these are very precious gifts that we don't notice on our that we didn't notice in our normal lives, when we got to work, when we had to cook the meals for the family, when we had to, commute to work. Now we have more time in our day, in our 24 hours, to be more conscious of what we're doing.
So some of the things we did during the lockdown is, for example, we know that it is safer to be outdoor. So more people go to parks and enjoy nature.
Mhm.
And sometimes in the city life, nature is something we totally neglect. For example, how many times have you looked at the sky today, right?
Mhm.
Sometimes we never look up, right?
Yep. We're actually more so looking down nowadays
Right.
on our
On the
phones.
phone, right?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. So then you can look up at the sky, but also, you know that in Japan, it's a fashionable now to have a thing called forest bathing. Have you heard of it?
I've heard of,
Yeah.
forest bathing, and I've also heard the term forest therapy too, in fact, now.
Forest bathing as a therapy in a way, in that people actually deliberately go into the woods to appreciate the feeling of being inside the woods and forest. Allow that to give them a meditative state, I guess, and that would be very healing. So in a way, nature is something we neglected in our busy lives, and that is something that people have picked up and some people are continuing, especially now the summer is here, and I think lots of people are realizing that how precious, this is our contact with nature.
Absolutely. And I think in winter, it would be a very different story or a different painting to paint. It doesn't, we don't get the long daylights, unfortunately, here in Toronto. But I totally agree. I think through the pandemic myself, I've been connecting a lot more with nature. I've been having, you can see behind me, I've got these plants that I've been planting. I have one next to me as well. It really does, with this pandemic, it really does help us open our eyes and to see there's more in this. If you live in cities, there's more than just the hustle and bustle, but there's so much around you in the environment that is so beautiful that we've neglected for a long time.
Yeah. And then looking at home, there are two lessons I've got. One is that you really can do a lot of things that you have not got time to do before. Some would bake, right? And others would actually learn a music or learn a language even, right?
Yeah.
So that they prepare for the next trip. And however, it is also very hard. In a lot of family, when the space is limited, you're crammed together and temper sometimes flare and relationship can actually worsen. Even in Wuhan, when they started the lockdown 2 years ago, actually, once they lift the lockdown, one place that they was very busy is the divorce bureau.
Oh.
Signed up for that because when two couples never got along, but before they don't see each other so much, maybe just a couple of hours a day. Now have to be together 24/7. It's very difficult. So that shows us how we need to really be careful about the impact on our relationship at home. Be more, in a way, forgiving and understanding, knowing that it's hard for everyone. And then whether we can develop some common understanding and strategy to deal with that. Yeah. But for some of the family or couples, it actually put them together more and they actually develop a deeper relationship too. So it goes both ways. But it's good to be mindful of the effect on us.
Absolutely. I do work with some couples in my practice, and absolutely throughout the pandemic, I think conflicts have definitely heightened. I mean, we spend more than 20, we spend the whole 24 hours at home at some point of this pandemic. Of course, we're going to see experiences that you weren't used to before when you went to work, or you didn't have to face before when we had to go to work. And with this pandemic being at home, it's normal to have conflicts, but I think what you pointed out is very key, to forgive and to take a step back, and to communicate and to find ways to recognize these conflicts and work through it together, whether it's with the family or as a couple living together.
So some of these learnings are individual, but as a society, I think we are learning a lot too. a lot of inequities are exposed. And
Mm,
also a lot of generosity I experienced too, people
yeah.
helping one another. And that, I mean, this kind of concept about challenges, bringing sometimes the best of us out. And you can see, I mean, the war in Ukraine is another example that you can see the courage of people and also the generosity of people addressing the Ukrainians. So I think if we are mindful of what the community is doing, we can actually do meaningful things. And in the beginning of the pandemic, we actually, from Hong Kong Mental Health Service, we have organized a webinar in different languages for all the Asian communities to help them cope and even help one another. So our topic is thriving together. Okay,
Mhm.
and
Wow,
I think that is really nice. Yeah.
that does sound like a very key thing to have during the pandemic and even post-pandemic, when we do encounter these really big collective changes in our society. Thriving together, that is a beautiful way of putting it, as a community, how we can support, how we can go through, experience it together. And I don't think anyone is ever alone in their experiences. And the worst thing to feel is that you are lonely, you are the only one. But that's not the truth. In fact, there's a lot of other people who are probably also kind of experiencing that alongside you as well. So thriving together, that's a very interesting webinar to take away too.
Actually, when you come together, actually you are actually much more effective in changing the institution and the system, which is a very good time at this time after pandemic to look at possible changes and advocate and strive for them. So that actually would be a very worthwhile thing to learn from the pandemic.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Ted. Sorry. Thank you so much, Dr. Ted, for
Okay.
this chat. It's these reflections from the pandemic, from COVID. It's so important. Doing the proper individual risk assessments. Takeaways from the lockdowns, the connections, the way your time changed and adapting to the new changes. These are so important, not only for the pandemic, but even for whatever big changes the society encounters now. We know we can see these changes constantly coming and going, and these are ways that we can cope and better grow instead of taking steps backwards. I do believe if we choose to keep an eye on an open mind and to have the courage and bravery to face the challenges, it is actually an opportunity to learn and to grow. Thank you, Dr. Ted, for being here with us today. And thank you, viewers, for tuning in to Chats with Dr. Ted. Today, we talked about our reflections from COVID.